something has happened inside the passage that's worthy of our note. And when we live in a world where we tend to be buffeted, bruised, beaten, it's important to at least believe that while sometimes evil might wound me, in the end it cannot win. Consider that kingship in Israel began with the telling of how power was going to be abused, how people would be abused, how property would be abused. It is why God has to say to the prophet Samuel, it is not you that they are rejecting. It is me they are rejecting. And in their asking for a king, what they will encounter is what they did not want. I will give them the desire of their heart. I will give them the king that they want. But when they get that king, help them to realize that that king is going to abuse people. That king is going to abuse property. That king is going to abuse his power. And they will rue the day that they asked to be led by a king. That's why 1 Kings 21 is significant, in that God has now come to manifest clearly, since you asked for it, this is what you've got. And Israel is no different than those of you and I in the 21st century, except that there are some things about Naboth that are worthy to be recognized and appreciated. I call your attention to verse 1 of 21 in 1 Kings, and notice that Naboth is the owner of a vineyard that the king has decided he wants to confiscate. But what Naboth understands is that there are some things for which I cannot sell out. Being sold out for what is right is different from selling out. And from time to time, Christians have to identify with what it means to be sold out, to be steadfast, unmovable, simply because that's what God calls us to do and calls us to be. And Naboth has come to a posture where it doesn't matter how much he's offered. Naboth has made a decision that my motivation is beyond money. You can't, O king, offer me enough to make me sell my property, sell my ancestry, and sell the generation that's coming behind me. You don't have enough money to buy me like that. In fact, it reminds me of a story of a man that walked into a club and saw a very attractive woman. And because she was so attractive, he decided that he would push up on her. He had just won the lottery and had a pocket full of money. And so he slides up to her and says, hey, listen, I got a question. I got $100,000 in my pocket that I'm willing to burn if you will sleep with me. She said, $100,000? He said, I tell you what, would you sleep with me for $2? And she paused and reared back and said, what kind of woman do you think I am? He said, we've already established that. We just negotiated now. Because there are some people who will sell their soul for a dollar bill. There are some people for whom money is such a motivation that there's nothing to which they will not say no. And what we have in the text is a man named Naboth who has decided that, you know what? There are some things that simply are not worth it. And no matter how much you offer me, it is not going to be for sale. Now, it's helpful to understand where Naboth is coming from and perhaps where we should. Naboth is a man who understands that the land is not just his land. In the ancient world, when God gave property to people, it wasn't a kind of Donald Trumpish sort of ownership. When you owned property in the ancient world, it was not your property to keep. Because at the 50th year of Jubilee, property returned back to the original owners. So that the only reason why people were able to have property in the ancient world was that, number one, God had given it. And God gave it for the purpose of using it, not so that you could use it own it, and then rip somebody off by selling it for twice you paid for it. He gave land to Israel because he was essentially giving to Israel harvests that would be there for the generation that was coming behind them. When Naboth goes back home and is sullen, and Jezebel asks him, what is the problem? Notice that Jezebel asks a question here inside verse 6. I asked Naboth to sell me his vineyard or trade it, but he refused, Ahab told her. Keep in mind that that's not the whole story. What Naboth actually said was that this property is an inheritance, and God forbid that I give to you what doesn't belong to me, because the property that I have, I don't really own. It's just on loan to me to use until God says it's up. And if I give to you what God has given to me, then the people coming behind me won't have anything for themselves. And the next harvest and the next harvest that has to be planted and then harvested so that they can grow, so that they can live, so that they can survive. If I give away to you what God has given to me, I'll be destroying the people who are coming behind me. And sometimes it's possible to be so motivated by money and other things that you lose sight of the fact that it ain't all about you. It's about some other people who are coming behind you, and you're not doing it just to make yourself better. You're looking down a telescopic lens at those who are coming behind you and trying to make sure that when they get there, something you've done in the present will impact them as they come your way. Am I making sense to anybody? Sometimes you can become so driven with the idea of how to gain, you lose much more than you gain. And Naboth is clear that what I have has been given to me as a matter of God's grace. You see, when God gave out land in the ancient world, nobody was receiving land because they deserved it. They were receiving land because land was a manifestation of God's grace. And whenever you receive a gift is always an indicator of the character of the giver. That's why every now and then you'll measure the gift in relationship to what you know about the giver. Since I'm using Trump-like analogies, if I was a friend of Donald Trump and he were to give me 2 tickets for dinner to Applebee's, I would not tell you how grateful I was. Somebody would say, well, you know, you don't deserve anything, and you should be grateful that you have 2 meals at Applebee's. But that's not what I would be saying. I would be saying he's a billionaire. And the billionaire just gave me some cheese fries. And I don't understand how a billionaire could give me 2 tickets to Applebee's. Well, when God was giving out chunks of land that nobody deserved, what they understood was that the grace gift, its size was indicative of the heart of the giver. And so what God does is he sends the prophet back to the scene of the crime and says, listen, you need to understand something, that now the owner of the land has showed up. The land really didn't belong to Naboth. Naboth had good cause to look back at Ahab and say, no, I'm not going to give away what doesn't belong to me but belongs to my ancestry, but i.e. belongs to God. I'm not giving you that. But then God said, you know what? You can't do evil and get away with it. In the text, you've got the weak that are wicked. You've got the strong that are wicked. You've got the submissive that are wicked. But God says, know what? No matter what level of evil, nobody gets away with anything. And the reality is, when you consider this whole narrative, it's why you've got to be careful when you deal with evil power. Because whenever you deal with wickedness that possesses power, the way they manifest that power is always consistent with their evil nature. And when you push back against power that is wicked, you are exercising, yes, your independence, but you've got to be careful about how you do it. You see, there's a reason why when some folks get stopped by law enforcement, they end up shot by law enforcement, not because they're bad people or have done anything wrong, but when people have authority and power and are wicked, they will exercise that power through wickedness. And what you've got to be careful of is how you respond in relationship to your independence. Because when righteousness pushes back against evil, evil becomes more evil. And you see, when you are, listen, when you have been endowed by God the right of posture and power in a right way, there is always a case to be made for standing up for your right. But you got to stand up for your right in a way that's righteous. Because if you don't, wicked power will take you out. And the truth is that Naboth does stand up and defend his right to remain the steward of the property that God gave. He stands up for what is his, and he does it righteously, but it still got him killed. And sometimes you can die standing for what is right. Now that's the decision you've got to make, because it's better to be buried under stones than to be a stoner. Jezebel goes to the leadership and has them co-sign wickedness that she knows is legislationally wrong and theologically unsound. But there are people in this world that will take you out in a way that tries to make it look respectable. And they will use law in order to destroy you, even if they have to use it wickedly. She goes to the ecclesiastical elite as well as the law, and they co-sign a kind of evil act. And beloved, you need to be real clear. We need to be teaching this and training our boys and girls in Sunday school about how to respond to authority properly. If you don't, you are setting them up to be killed. You can't just respond to evil any way you want, and you can't just respond to authority any way you want. Show me a child, a son or a daughter, who won't hear their mother and their father, and I'll show you a teacher, a pastor, or somebody who doesn't stand a chance. Because if they won't listen to the people who gave them life, they won't listen to anybody. And we've got to teach a generation that's coming behind us how to respect and how to respond to authority, even when that authority is not right. If we don't, we are setting them up to be wounded. We are setting them up to be killed. This is a plot that thickens. You say, why is that? Because when the text reminds us of his response, and I can't be long. It says, verse 5, what's the matter? His wife Jezebel asked him, what's made you so upset that you're not eating? I asked Naboth to sell me his vineyard or trade it, but he refused. Ahab told her. And remember, he didn't tell her the whole story. She wrote letters, conspired with the leaders and the elders, and they had Naboth murdered, stoned to death. You got to recognize something, at least to Jezebel's, I guess, character. Jezebel is the daughter of Ethbaal. 1 Kings 16. King Ethbaal was her daddy. Jezebel was Phoenician. And when Ahab is turning his face to the wall like a baby, what's running through Jezebel is the fact that my daddy was a king. And I know what strong kings look like. My daddy was Ethbaal, king of the Phoenicians. And I grew up in the household of a dictator. And I know what strong leadership look like. And right now, with your back to me and your face to the wall, you don't look nothing like my daddy. Now, I'm not here to elevate Jezebel, but I'm here to make a point. That sometimes when grown men act like boys, it's just fair to recognize that all they do is frustrate everybody around them. That when grown men still act more like children, we can castigate women all we want about they don't do this, they don't do that. But if you don't do it, church got quiet on you. I'm not advocating evil, but I'm submitting to you that something is taking place here that's nuanced. And before you decide to do anything, be thinking of the impact it will have. You say, Williams, why would you say a thing like that? Because sin hits the fan, not the other stuff. You see, when you stay in this text, you see that there is a residual impact on Ahab's sin for himself, Jezebel, the family, his dynasty, and they all pay a price. And I know you think that your sin just affects you. But what you don't understand is that when an officer sins and takes the life of the innocent, that one sin doesn't just affect the person who's been destroyed. It affects the family of that man who's been destroyed. The children and the wife and the mother and the other offspring of that man who's been destroyed. And for the perpetrator, it affects his family and his children and those who come behind him, which is why we tend to think that sin is personal, but sin is never personal. It's always public. And I'm not telling you that God doesn't forgive it, but don't act as if you can't recognize that it's got residual impact. Because what happens is your stuff is not just your stuff. If I got to meet you in the street, your stuff becomes my stuff because I got to deal with you. And everybody else around you has to deal with you. So the idea that it's just me and mine, no, it's not just me and mine. Your issue is my issue. And it becomes the issue of us all. There's a bunch of folks here in this text that are going to be negatively impacted by this. There's something here that inspires me to some degree because God, even in the Old Testament, you see the manifestation of his mercy. Verse 20, and I'm heading to the finish line. Back it up to verse 17. But the Lord said to Elijah, go down to meet King Ahab of Israel, who rules in Samaria. He will be at Naboth's vineyard in Jezreel, claiming it for himself. Give him this message. This is what the Lord says. Wasn't it enough that you killed Naboth? Must you rob him too? Because you have done this, dogs will lick your blood at the very place where they licked the blood of Naboth. In verse 20, when Ahab sees Elisha, here's his response. So, my enemy, you have found me, Ahab exclaimed to Elijah. And I would argue that by virtue of the fact that he says that, he's aware of his own guilt. Nobody talks like that if they don't know they're guilty. In 1 Kings 18, you'll have them calling Elisha the troubler of Israel. But you know what? Sometimes it's easy to mistake your friend for an enemy. You see, the truth is that at this moment, Elijah is the best friend Ahab will ever have. Because a good friend will tell you about yourself. You see, the people you call Facebook friends, they will lie to your face and tell you how good you are and how great you are. But consider this, if I got a problem with my kidneys and I go to a doctor and he starts to tell me about how good my vision is, that's not going to save me. I need somebody to tell me you got a problem with your kidneys in order to save my life. And sometimes the person who looks like your enemy really is your friend. Sometimes the person who looks like your friend is really your enemy. When Elijah comes to him, he comes to him as a manifestation of God's grace. And Ahab would be wise to recognize Elisha as a friend, not as his enemy. The rest of the story will have Ahab repenting and being restored, even though the impact is significant. And that's a God of good grace. But let me tell you this. I was listening the other day to Tavis Smiley as I was thinking about this and preparing this. And one of the things I thought was that sin will always blind you to the identity of who your enemy is and your friend is. But Tavis was saying that he had lost his job at BET. And when he lost his job at BET, it was the most devastating time of his life. It sent him into a state of depression. He felt the only thing that I've been doing with my life for decades is broadcasting, television, journalism, reporting. And when Bob Johnson fired him from BET, he said for weeks he would not leave the house. He said, but he got a call from Maya Angelou. And Maya Angelou said, Tavis, have you written your thank you letter yet? And he said, what are you talking about? Why? This is the most devastating time in my life. Why in the world would I be writing Bob Johnson and BET a thank you letter? He said, but then he realized as time went by that he was now hosting his own show on PBS. He had written 2 books. He was now touring and speaking in regards to poverty. And he thought, you know what? If she had not helped him to understand that the worst time in his life with people who he thought were his enemies were actually the best time in his life, and that his enemies actually were able to move him in a direction that he would have never gone before. I'm preaching now. This is why sometimes you got to look at God and thank him for your enemies. Because even though they can wound, at the end of the day, evil can't win. Now, you might have to go through some stuff, and you might have to cry sometimes. And you might have to go through periods of depression. I'm not one of those Christians who believe that just because I love Jesus, I don't have to experience the residual effects of the fall. You can love Jesus and still go into depression. You can love Jesus and still be suicidal. You can love Jesus and still think there's nothing worth living for. But sooner or later, you come up out of that place and you start to realize what they meant for evil, God meant for good. And I know when they were doing it, they didn't know what was happening. But the job you lost was God's way of elevating you. The person that walked out was God's way of strengthening you. The thing you lost was the discovery of something greater. And evil can wound you, but it does not win. And when you realize that, it changes how you worship. It changes how you walk. It changes how you think. And you get up and you say, by God's grace, I'm going to run and see what the end. You know our example? His name is Jesus. And one day the enemies thought they had taken him out. On Friday they thought it was over. On Saturday they knew it was done. On Sunday they had a party. But I read somewhere that the stone was rolled away. And on the 3rd day he got up, and every enemy, every no good somebody was conquered death, hell, and the grave. And even though you get wounded, we've got a victor, and we are victorious. And that's our hope. In a world that grows more debased, more decadent, sometimes I get wounded. But I'm glad that evil cannot win. I cannot lose with the one on my side. You can kill me, but you can't eat me. And King Kong ain't got nothing on Jesus. Make that your hope. Make that your strength. Make that your sustenance.